Good morning and welcome to our NYC Boardroom Breakfast with Andrew Rigie, Executive Director of the New York City Hospitality Alliance. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize the passing of Mayor David N. Dinkins. He was truly a trailblazer in New York City, and our Abney community is grateful for the inspiration he gave us every day. We will miss him deeply, and we send our condolences to his children and grandchildren and everyone that he affected. I'd like to start this boardroom breakfast by welcoming everyone for joining and thanking Andrew and Laura. I'm going to pass it off to Laura, who will moderate the conversation in just a minute. Before we begin, I'd like to announce an exciting call to action. In order to support our local restaurants, we're asking all of you on the call and to spread it to your friends to show your support for New York City restaurants in the month of December. So throughout this month, we'd love you to take a selfie with your restaurant menu or takeout bag, post it on Twitter or Instagram, and tag us and the Hospitality Alliance with the hashtag New York City Dining December. We'll repost your post on social media, and one lucky YP will be featured on the Abney YP newsletter. I'll put this in the chat and mention it again at the end, but we really hope that you can join us in showing our support for the restaurants and institutions that really make New York City, New York City. Without further ado, I will pass it on to Laura Rothrock, Senior Vice President of Government and Community Affairs at Nicholas and Lentz Communications and YP Steering Committee member. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning. As Sarah said, I'm Laura Rothrock, Senior Vice President of Government and Community Affairs at Nicholas and Lentz Communications. I'm honored to be hosting today this Abney YP Boardroom Breakfast with our special guest, Andrew Rigie. For those of you who don't know Andrew, he's the Executive Director of the New York City Hospitality Alliance, which is an association representing restaurants and nightlife venues throughout the 5 boroughs. Andrew got his start working at his family's 3rd generation bakery in Queens and joined the New York State Restaurant Association in 2004, working his way up to becoming the Executive Vice President overseeing the association's New York City operations. In 2012, Andrew launched the New York City Hospitality Alliance as the founding executive director. And the Alliance has grown into a premier organization delivering information, education services, and representing thousands of restaurants and nightlife venues in the halls of government and in the media. And as you all probably know, Andrew has become a critical voice and a resource for the hospitality industry during the COVID-19 crisis. Rigie also serves as chair of New York City's Office of Nightlife Advisory Board, vice chair of Community Board 7 in Manhattan, and he's a member of the New York State and the New York City COVID-19 committees. He is a vocal industry advocate, public speaker, frequent panelist and moderator, host of the Hospitality and Politics podcast, which everyone should check out, and a Forbes and Total Food Service News contributing author. He's a recognized commentator on local, national, and international media platforms. So welcome, Andrew. I'm going to start by asking some questions, and then I'll open it up to the audience where you can put your Q&A in the chat. So first, I'm going to start off with a softball for you. Tell us a little bit about you. I think, as with our audience, our young professional audience today probably want to know about how you got your start and what in 2012, when you launched the New York City Hospitality Alliance, what was that experience like and what made you launch this new organization?
Great, well, good morning and thanks so much for having me. The whole Abney team is just really fantastic. And I think times that are so challenging like those that we're in, it just makes it so important that there are organizations like Abney out there bringing people together to have these types of important conversations. Yeah, I mean, my background, it was kind of just those classic stories of, I grew up in the industry, always worked different capacities within food service and restaurants and never knew exactly what I wanted to do, tried a lot of different things. And somehow I just kind of got pulled back into the food service world and went to culinary school and always also like kind of politics and working with people. And who knew that there was a crossroads where the hospitality, food service, nightlife industry and politics crossed, and that was in the association world. And then when we launched the Hospitality Alliance back in 2012, it was New York City, such a unique place. I mean, just in the 5 boroughs alone, there's more than 25,000 eating and drinking establishments. They employ more than 300,000 people, or at least pre-pandemic they did. And we're so critical to not only the economic footprint, but the social fabric of New York City. And it was at a time when, you know, just the city started enacting more policies and laws and rules, as well as the state impacting New York City business owners. And a lot of people in the industry felt that it would make sense to have our own independent citywide association to represent us. And I was fortunate enough to know and be around and to have worked with a lot of the leaders in the industry at that time who said, you know, let's form our own association. And they really wanted to do it. They said to me, would you want to be the founding, you know, kind of executive director? And it was a big choice. You know, I had left the state association where I had been for years, and, you know, from the time I was in my early 20s, I had learned a lot and been a really established organization, I think around for about 75 years at the time, where, you know, you had benefits, and like anything else, when you're jumping out on your own, there's certainly a lot of risk involved, but I think there's also a lot of reward. And I think personally, I have some tolerance for risk. I'm not just like crazy, like do whatever. But I think it was making a calculated risk. And the thing that I knew that kind of got me to jump in, do it, launch the organization with 110% of everything that I had was, one, I knew the people that I was around. And that was so important. People that I could trust, people that supported me, people that I would listen to, and that would also listen to me. And I think it forged a good foundation. And then I think just, you know, you're never 100% confident in anything you do, but I had enough confidence that put me in there and I'll just figure out what the hell I need to do, you know? And I think it was a combination of having a good support system and people around me, and then just, you know, being unsure, but also having the confidence that no matter what happens, we'll figure it out. And that's kind of like what happens in the restaurant industry. You just kind of got to figure it out on the fly so often.
That's what I always tell people, you know, nobody really knows what they're doing. We're all kind of flying by different pants. I always tell young people that you got to figure it out. So the hospitality industry, as everybody knows, has been, you know, devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly the New York City hospitality industry. And so you and your organization has asked City Council for assistance on a number of fronts, including a sales tax grant program, rent relief, testing, PPE, license renewals. Can you talk a little bit about these efforts, and what do you think is the most critical that the City Council can do right now?
Sure. I have to say, out of all levels of government, sometimes I can't even believe I'm saying this. I think this City Council and this mayor have done more to support local restaurants in particular over the past 6, 7, 8 months than they have over the past 6, 7, 8 years. And I think maybe for another conversation, there's a lot of reasons why, everything from suspending enforcement of personal liability guarantees and leases to capping third-party delivery fees and a lot more. But now we're calling on the city to do more. And one of the reasons we need that, frankly, is the inaction of the federal government to enact a policy called the Restaurants Act and the Save Our Stages Act, which effectively are grant programs that help restaurants and nightlife venues pay for rent, utilities, payroll, vendors. You know, it's not just the people directly in the industry, but it's the upstate farmer we purchase our produce from, the fisherman out in Long Island, the sales rep, or the person that sells you beer or technology products. So it's the whole ecosystem that relies on a vibrant hospitality sector. And I think many in city government get that, see that, understand it, and thankfully have been enacting policies. But because the inaction of the federal government to enact these two policies makes it more incumbent for the city to step up and help. And, you know, when we're trying to think about policies and what we can do to support, you know, it's not just enough to say we love restaurants, we support our small businesses. We actually need to craft policies that will support them and then have the political will to enact them. So often you hear people say, well, we need a sales tax holiday. And that is often a popular theme. You know, it will drive consumers to go make more purchases. And perhaps it works more in retail because it's something that's kind of like built into just the culture, you know, sales tax holiday, this is the week to go shop. But really what restaurants and other small business owners need is cash flow. So instead of just, you know, if you're going to forgive sales tax, instead of just saying shoppers don't pay sales tax, you should pay the sales tax, but instead let the business owner keep it. Effectively turn that sales tax collection into a cash grant for the business. That way they have regular payroll, you know, cash coming into the business to help them keep people employed, pay payroll, rent, all these other expenses. Also making sure that when inspectors go out and do inspections, the focus should be education, training, and compliance first, and then levying fines and penalties as an absolute last resort, particularly if it's not related, if the violation is not related to like an immediate hazard to the public or to workers. So the city's been doing a pretty good job on that, but they need to continue, focus on education, training. And then also when it comes to PPE, you know, gloves, masks, all these things cost a lot of money, and restaurants, they go through them so quickly. So we need to continue to supply them to restaurants, but then also providing COVID tests would be something great the city could do, even on site at the restaurants, because if one customer or a worker may have tested positive, it triggers this whole chain reaction of testing. And as I'm sure people have been reading lately, you know, the hours upon hours that people are waiting to get these tests. When restaurants have to do this, particularly for all their workers, it really disrupts their operations. They have to close. So if we could expedite these tests, hopefully even on premise, in many cases, it would allow restaurants to get back open, operating safely, quickly, which is so important because really they have no time to waste and no dollars to spare.
And so I saw some stats that you put out that 130,000 people are out of work in the hospitality industry. Those numbers are up a little bit from the shutdown in March due to outdoor dining. And by all accounts, you know, the outdoor dining program was really a success. And I just, being an outsider, it seemed like the city, you know, worked really hard to cut some of the red tape and simplify the process for restaurants and bar owners. But now that the colder temperatures are upon us, it seems like, you know, there's a number of new challenges like snow removal and heating. Can you talk about what this is going to mean for the restaurant industry and the outdoor dining program in the city?
Yeah, I'm going to owe Winston Churchill's family royalties because I so often use this quote, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And that's exactly what I think of when I think of the outdoor dining program, some other policies. Really, the city for so long had all this red tape, bureaucracy, costs to do with permitting, licensing, particularly about sidewalk cafes. But it showed when the pandemic hit, we could really cut through this red tape, you know, allow self-certification, get rid of some of the timeframes in which businesses would have to wait to set up outdoor dining, get rid of a lot of the fees involved that, you know, were difficult for small business owners to afford, and actually resulted in a lot of small businesses never getting sidewalk cafes because they didn't even think they could really afford it. So the city did a great job. There are certainly hiccups and issues, but when you're standing up a program like this in the midst of a pandemic, to have more than 10,500 restaurants participating in outdoor dining is important. But as you mentioned, even with the new allowance for heat lamps and some other features to try to keep people warm in the winter, it gets pretty brutally cold in the city. I mean, even some nights now, I don't think the vast majority of people dining out are going to continue as the weather drops. So it poses a lot of challenges. Pre-pandemic, more than 300,000 jobs plummeted to about 90,000 back in April after the initial shutdown. We've hired back about 100,000, still about 130,000 workers short. And now with the new limitations on indoor dining, which is still at 25%, but they've reduced the hours of operation, talks about another potential shutdown, and the fact that, as I said before, outdoor dining is not going to be as feasible during the freezing cold days and nights ahead of us, we could see, up to 100,000 of these jobs just poof, gone again. And, these are everyday people, I mean, from all walks of life. And for the most part, you were not talking about people with, large investments or cash in their accounts. We are talking in many cases low income workers. We're talking about immigrant workers. We're talking about people in many cases who may not have options for work elsewhere in the workforce. People that have families. I mean, these are like the everyday New Yorkers that make New York run. And if they're out of work, it's a dire situation. It compounds the dire situation people are already in. And without the enhanced federal unemployment, also, if people are ineligible to receive unemployment, you are putting, to 100,000 people on top of the 130,000 that are out, just out of work. And these small business owners that invested their lives working so hard to build up these beloved restaurants and bars, I mean, they've exhausted their personal savings, maxed out credit cards, taken out loans. So I hate to be so doom and gloom, but it is doom and gloom, and it's a massive challenge. And we need government now to step up with the same size of stimulus package to give these workers and small business owners a fighting chance of survival, because the only way New York comes back, frankly, is if our restaurants and our nightlife come back. I mean, we are so essential to the fabric of the city, and our industry kind of weaves through all other sectors of the economy, but also just the social interactions that we have.
Well, that's a good segue into my next question, which is, I'm sure when you started the Alliance, you knew that you'd be working with city and state government, but how important is federal government to you right now? And how do you think the Biden administration will affect, and potentially a change in the Senate leadership particularly, will affect the New York City hospitality industry?
So, yeah, it's a big question. I mean, we focused on city and state. Generally, not exclusively, but for the most part, what impacted the industry pre-pandemic were city and state regs. There were some federal issues, but really city and state for the most part. Clearly, that changed with the arrival of COVID. And unfortunately, the city and state, we know, are in a dire financial situation themselves and face so many different challenges, not just within our industry, but from all sectors of society. And the federal government just has put politics over saving people's livelihoods. I think so much of it is a lack of consideration. Fortunately, the New York delegation has been very supportive of our industry. Senator Schumer has been tremendous, a big advocate for the Restaurants Act and the Save Our Stages Act, which are those two bills I mentioned earlier, which, mind you, were passed by the House of Representatives in the HEROES Act months ago. And there's bipartisan support in the Senate. In the US Senate, I mean, there's 49 sponsors in the Senate for the Restaurants Act. So these things really aren't that controversial. So I am hoping with the incoming Biden administration that it won't even be a question. We need to pass these bills immediately. Clearly, those two Senate seats that are up for grabs, I think if they go to the Democrats and they take control, absolutely. These programs will be passed. They'll be stood up as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, that could be February, March. And here we are, it's not even December yet, and so many of these businesses are teetering on the edge of survival. So I am hopeful that, a Biden administration, and if the Democrats do take control of the Senate, will get the support. The unfortunate part is that I don't think a lot of these businesses and jobs are going to be able to make it that far. So we really, really, truly need the federal government to act now. I mean, it should have acted months ago, but it's beyond absurd and disrespectful, and frankly, just a lack of sympathy and empathy for what people are going through. And it's a shame, but I'm hopeful that something will get done. To me, it's not if the restaurant and nightlife industry will recover. I mean, it is part and parcel of who we are and what we are as a people and as of the city. My question is, in the more short and medium term, how do we mitigate damage? How do we mitigate loss? How do we support as many people as possible from really having their lives destroyed? So, you know, that would be my pitch. Just get it done. Let's not look back at ourselves in months or years and be like, why the hell didn't we save this industry? And the last thing I just say on that, because I see people saying, you know, the restaurant industry needs a bailout. And I just want to make it very clear that this is not a bailout. A bailout implies that the industry did something wrong. You know, restaurants and bars were shut by government, not because you didn't like their burger, not because you didn't like their service. They were shut by government. And now we need that same government to step up and support us.
That's a really good point. So being a parent to small children, and one of which is in elementary school, you know, obviously this time has been challenging, as all parents understand. And so there's a lot of rhetoric in New York City about, okay, if whether schools are open or closed is based on community spread, then why can bars and restaurants stay open but schools have to close? And, you know, also being a representative to clients in the hospitality industry, I also see the other side that, you know, some of these restrictions can be arbitrary sometimes, and not necessarily follow the data and the science. Although, you know, I think I'll give credit where credit is due. I think no one has a playbook for, you know, how to do this. It's truly an unprecedented time, as everyone keeps saying. How do you balance and navigate that rhetoric in your role when you're, you know, when schools are closing and there's a lot of angry parents out there?
Well, yeah, so I'm one of them. My daughter is in kindergarten, and the 2 days a week or 1 day a week that she was going in person were like the greatest days, not just, you know, for myself and my, you know, wife and everything, but, you know, she loved it. And you saw just really how she would thrive and her enthusiasm for being there in person. And so we were really fortunate like that. And when it got shut, obviously it was a real, just like, you know, gut punch, like, and we hope she can go back quickly. You know, I'm a big New York Times reader, but when they published the editorial that, you know, schools need to stay open and the restaurants need to be shut, I think it connected two dots for a lot of people in government and a lot of just parents and just a lot of people that read the Times. And I don't necessarily think those dots needed to be connected. I think they can run parallel. You know, the city schools, that is one specific issue. I guess sometimes it's controlled by the city, sometimes it's controlled by the state. And then the restaurants are controlled by the state, even though sometimes the city, I should say the opening or closing restrictions are controlled by the state, even though sometimes the mayor will comment on whether they should be closed or open or limited. I think there's a few things we need to look at. One, this is a big complex city with lots of different things happening, and it's not necessarily fair to compare one to the other. I think a lot of the health experts and others say schools should not have been closed right now. And if you look at restaurants, you know, restaurants have been open indoors at 50% indoor occupancy since back in June. And there was no increase in infections. In fact, we continue to see infection rates go down, down, down while they are open for indoor dining. And then as you know, in September, indoor dining opened at 25% here in the city. And we saw it continue to go down, but then we saw the spikes. It seems that a lot of the spikes and increased infection rates are coming from private social gatherings, not from restaurants. We have not seen contact tracing data that relates it to restaurants. So I think we need to look at two separately. I think it was unfortunately, and it was kind of a scapegoat to say, oh, we need to close restaurants. Personally, because I'm connected to it with a daughter, like I understand as a parent, like when you're like, why the hell are the schools closed, but like I can go out and eat? It makes no sense. I mean, I saw people tweeting like, oh, well, why don't we just go have kids, you know, learn inside of restaurants and then it would be fine, which, you know, it's very kind of a retweetable, if that's even a word, tweet. But from a public policy perspective, maybe the schools shouldn't have been shut down. And if they weren't shut down, then we wouldn't even be having this discussion and restaurants would be judged on their own. So that's the extremely long-winded way of saying I think schools and restaurants need to be looked at separately. Just because you do one thing in one place does not necessarily mean you have to do something elsewhere. So I think we need to look at things independently and we need to use our best judgment dealing with those specific issues. And look, of course, public health and safety need to be paramount. But like I said before, people are out of work, people are losing their businesses, and we cannot undermine or undercut or disregard the significant economic and social tolls that these closures are having on hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom do not have the same social safety net as many of those people who are calling for them to be shut down or limited in their operation. So that's not a jab to them. It's just like the reality of the situation, and it's an impossible situation, and why we need the federal government to pass those bills I mentioned.
And how much access do you have to data, the contact tracing data or other health data to help you advocate for the industry? Because I see, you know, a lot of times it seems like the regulations are seem to be stricter in New York City, and sometimes, you know, I don't know if that actually makes sense. And are you able to look at some of that data and to help you advocate for restaurants staying open?
I mean, we see some of the data. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much or any data related to contact tracing in restaurants. And, you know, this is what gets tough is, you know, if we are so focused on science, if we are so focused on being data driven in our decisions, my opinion is that we need to back up those decisions with the science and with the contact tracing data. And I think people, especially 8 months into this pandemic, rightfully get frustrated and angry in many cases when they feel like decisions are being made that they don't fully understand. And I guess that's natural and normal to a degree, in so much that like people are living their own lives. They're not fully, you know, researching and understanding all the different aspects of all the different rules on different sectors. But I think there are things that people don't always feel make sense. And maybe not making sense isn't the best way to address it. It's they feel the burden that some of the policies inflict on the industry may be worse than if those policies were not enacted in the first place. So I think it's, you know, kind of complex, but are frustrated and angry, they feel forgotten, they feel their voices aren't being heard. And, you know, from myself, and I know I speak with other people that represent other industries or other groups, and people often, you know, feel the same. And it's an unenviable position to be a leader in government right now, because you're often damned if you do, damned if you don't. And, you know, don't do this, but what happens if you don't do anything and then something bad happens? So I just really think kind of communication and empathy are so important. And if you cannot provide, or I should say your level of government cannot provide the needed support for that industry sector like the restaurants, then you need to get on board and you need to start fighting and advocating at that level of government that can provide the support. You know, don't just say we can't do anything. Say I can't do anything or we can't do anything, but I'm going to join you in getting something done.
And I have one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the group. So if people can put their questions in the Q&A and get those ready. I thought, you know, I would end on some potentially positive news. So with the news of a couple of vaccines on the horizon that seem to be effective, are you optimistic that restaurants can increase their capacity, and how do you see that potentially rolling out? And also the events industry, which, as you know, my firm represents a number of operators in the events industry that have really been hurt by this. And do you see, not that you have a crystal ball, but what do you see as far as the spring, the summer, and what is kind of the talk in the industry of how we can come back?
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, the news about the vaccines is just wonderful. You know, I don't know. I think maybe April, let's see how these vaccines are able to get rolled out to people with the warm winter, kind of warmer weather after the winter. Let's hope, you know, April and going into the spring, you know, we'll be back to some degree and on hopefully a path to being back. But it's going to be tough. I think I mentioned it before. It's all about the loss between now and the time that all that is rolled out. So, you know, that's kind of the time frame that I see right now. But I'm also conscious that the whole pandemic has all been about uncertainty. So anytime you try to be certain about one thing, you know, you just don't want to be too certain. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, I guess. You know, you got to be nimble enough to continue to, the P word, you know, pivot here, pivot there. But what I would say, and I know it's been kind of doom and gloom, is that I know people in this industry. I mean, they are fighters. You know, you don't go into this industry for the faint of heart. You know, they are doing everything possible fighting through this. And so many of them, while it seems like they won't now, they will somehow get through this, and hopefully the federal government can act. But when you talk about event spaces, and we didn't even talk about nightlife, you know, clubs and bars, like who wants to socially distant dance? I mean, that's not like really a thing for the most part. And these are social spaces. It's the opposite of social distancing, where we come together with each other, express ourselves, you know, interact, you know, it's just part of the social cohesion of our city. So I think for nightlife in particular, for event spaces where people are booking weddings, bar mitzvahs, and all these other types of events many months out, it's going to be very difficult for them. But again, the foundation of the city relies on all of these types of industries, because it's not just about, you know, one sector of the economy. It's where we come together and live our lives. So I think, again, it will come back. But the question is, how do we mitigate the damage, and how do we also use this opportunity, this crisis, to rebuild this collective hospitality industry in a way that's more fair, more equitable, cuts the red tape, and then provides opportunities for many of these small business owners or hopeful small business owners from all walks of life to start opening up their own businesses. I mean, in one way, if you think about the late 90s, early 2000s, there was really this kind of rebirth and renaissance of restaurants and nightlife in the city, and all these restaurant groups formed, and restaurants started opening up all throughout the 5 boroughs, and there was this kind of foodie tourism. It wasn't just centered in one area, you know, in Manhattan. So if the commercial rents do go down and there's more opportunities for different people to open up these restaurants, I think we have an incredible restaurant and nightlife future ahead of us for the city. But a lot of it's going to come down to policymakers really listening to the voices of like your clients that have event spaces, and, you know, members that have restaurants and bars and nightlife, to mitigate the damage and create a more sustainable long-term environment for this industry.
Yeah. So we have some questions. The first one is from Samantha Diliberti. Hi, Sam. It's so funny because like I don't see people anymore, so I get excited when I see a familiar name. I really do miss interacting with everyone in person. So she asked about outdoor dining, which we discussed, but are there ways to address the shortage of propane for outdoor heating? Have you seen that as an issue?
Hi, Sam. Yes. You know, that's been difficult. I think, well, first off, until recently, propane was not even permitted. We did get the city to allow it. There are very strict requirements if you are using the propane heaters. One of those requirements is Well, I said part of those requirements also make it very difficult to store propane overnight. There are a couple of companies that have popped up that are doing drop off of propane canisters in the morning and then picking them up post service in the evening, which makes it easier to comply with the requirements. So I think that, you know, there are some companies out there that can help with it. But, you know, that's definitely a tough one. Just because the vast number of businesses out there. But Sam, you can definitely reach out if you have someone that needs them. I'd also look at the electric heaters too. Sometimes those may be a little bit easier to have to comply with all the regulations, but nothing's easy. Often you may have to have an electrician come in and do a whole bunch of work if you want to install commercial electric heaters. So there's a whole backstory there, and happy to help anyone that needs assistance, and they could reach out to us via the Hospitality Alliance and we'll help them.
Great. And this is from Robert Schwartz. What can we do to stop banks from redlining small businesses by freezing their lines of credit and other financial access in New York City during the pandemic?
You know, that's a good question. I mean, I guess you could look at like the State Department of Finance. I imagine if they have the charter, you know, if they're like state banks, there could be something they could potentially do. But it also goes back to the federal government. I think a lot of these banks, you know, and others are, and credit cards and stuff, you know, are related by the federal government. So, I mean, this is kind of what I implied, if I didn't say it directly before, is that there are so many of these issues, and many of them we need the federal government or the state government or the appropriate level of government to step in and address them. Because what's happening now is so many small business owners are being left behind or disenfranchised for the simple reason that they're in the middle of a pandemic, and there are all these forces that are impacting them. It's not something that they did wrong on their own. And that's why you need the federal government or government to step in and prohibit behaviors that shouldn't exist, especially during this time. And then also looking at how do we restructure the system so it's more fair and equitable to these business owners. I don't think anyone's looking for special handouts per se, or something to be done just for them for the sake of doing it, just appropriate attention and appropriate, you know, support. So I know kind of danced around the question, but I think government could come in because they regulate these entities and prohibit them from, you know, enacting specific types of policies.
And this is a good question from Alec Nadeau, which we didn't touch on this. The impacts of the subway closures on the hospitality industry. Have you been in conversations with the MTA or the state to try to understand when the service will be restored?
Yeah, so we definitely had conversations. This is a big issue. I'm actually going to be up on a panel early December with a lot of folks talking about this specific issue. You know, since the subway shut down, it wasn't a huge issue because outdoor dinings had to stop at 11 p.m. So that usually gave enough time to break down and close up the restaurant and people can get home on the trains. When indoor dining started on September 30th, and restaurants had to basically have their customers out by 12:30, in so many cases, they did not have enough time, and people were trying to figure it out because they were missing the train. Some restaurants were trying to call car services for their employees, but it's expensive and no one has money. So there are definitely conversations, because if we are the city that never sleeps, I mean, well, you need to have 24/7 subway service. And I think going back to your point about a Biden administration coming in, I think we need to make sure all our voices and advocates in the city, you know, talk about how important public transportation is to the city, particularly for people that are working in restaurants, working in nightlife, but also people that will be going out to restaurants and nightlife that need to take the trains home. So it's definitely an important part of our conversations. and needs to be addressed because it's really disrupting people's lives. But it, like so many other issues, are, or at least seem to be, contingent on funding. And you know, I think funding transit is just, it is so important.
And someone asked about the SLA. For those of you who don't know, the State Liquor Authority they seem to be out there issuing penalties and fines. And do you think that sometimes they've been acting too quickly and that they're punishing restaurants unnecessarily?
Yeah, so I always preface this by saying, one, as I said before, public health and safety has to be paramount. And if people are just blatantly violating the health and safety protocols, there needs to be consequences. However, and it's a big however, the vast majority of these businesses, by the state's own data, are in compliance and are doing the right thing. So in those cases where businesses have received these enormous fines, I mean, I've heard people paying, you know, between $30,000 and $50,000 to get their liquor licenses back. It just cannot stand. I mean, people are in such a dire financial situation as it is right now. So I think we need to figure out a way to eliminate or significantly reduce those violations and penalties, and only levy them in the worst situations. The goal here should not be fining and collecting revenue. The focus should be on compliance. And mind you, going back to what I said before, for years we had said to the city, and I know this is a state liquor authority question, but we had said to the city, you know, stop with all the fines. You know, we should focus on education and training first. If a violation does not pose an immediate hazard to workers or the public, issue a warning, allow a cure period before you issue a violation. Inspectors should point out a violation, explain why it's a violation, how to correct it, and, you know, come back. And if it's not fixed, then you issue a violation. And we always put that out there. But then finally in the pandemic, I think the city at least has been doing that. And we've had better compliance. And I think the mayor himself has said, you know, restaurants are doing the right thing. And through this, we're actually getting better compliance. So I think it is possible. And if it applies to city regulations, it certainly applies to state and federal regulations as well. So yes, violations in many cases are way too high, and they're punishing people when it's unnecessary.
And are there examples of best practices from other cities or states that are working well with restaurants and bars during the pandemic?
Yeah, I talk to people around the country and around the globe, and no one, unfortunately, has seemed to get it. I mean, the city, I think, and state, for all its failures, I don't know that we're worse off. I think we've actually led on some of the bills. I mentioned the suspension of personal liability contract clauses and leases. The delivery fee cap in the city has been actually working much better here than it has in some other states where perhaps the law wasn't drafted in the most effective way. But I think if you saw in Europe and elsewhere, in Canada, the big thing comes down to their federal government paying money. So when they're shutting people down, they are compensating them. And that, with the exception of the PPP, which was a lifetime ago and severely limited, has been it. So yes, the big picture tends to be outside of the US. It tends to be more in Europe and Canada, where they're actually compensating businesses and workers and taking care of them, versus here where they're kind of just saying, you know, you got to fend for yourself. Even though there's bipartisan support for bills, there's just, I guess, not the political will to get them done.
And you mentioned that making our industry stronger and more equitable after the pandemic is really important. What does a more equitable industry look like to you?
Yeah, well, a lot of things. I mean, one, I think we just need, if you look at the restaurant industry in particular, let's say, the person who's like the CEO of a bank or a big insurance company, usually, and maybe there's one or two that wrote best-selling books, like didn't start off in the mailroom. whereas the person that owns their own restaurant, but started as a dishwasher or a line cook or something of that sort, it's kind of almost everyone. So the industry, I think, already and historically has provided opportunities for people from all walks of life to grow through the ranks and then own their own business. I think one of the challenges over the past handful of years is it's gotten so challenging where you can't just be a good cook or a hospitable host. You need to be a real business person to run a restaurant. You need to have access to capital, and you need to have access to reporters and the press. And a couple of things, I think. One is we need to make access to capital to people available. And we need to look at things like, past taxes that they may not have paid or other barriers to entrepreneurship, and how do we reform them or get them out of the way? Because so often these barriers are put up against people by no fault necessarily of their own, but because of systemic inequalities, that have existed. So I think we need to make access to capital and basically not allowing things, taxes, et cetera, to prohibit them from getting access to capital or other types of resources. I think the press needs to be writing about different restaurants throughout New York City, not just the well-known, more prominent businesses. And then I think there's other laws. Right now the state of New York prohibits kitchen workers from participating in a restaurant's tip pool. So over the years, we've seen the wages and disparity of wages between front of house workers, servers, bartenders, and kitchen workers grow. And if we were allowed to share tips with back of house, it would increase the wages of back of house, many of whom are immigrants and minorities, and bring more pay equity, and hopefully bring more opportunities. So that's a few of them, and there's many more.
And shifting gears back to excuse me, back to outdoor dining. Can you address the issues of noise and cleanliness that some of the residential community brings up that go hand in hand with outdoor dining? And do you think some of those issues have been addressed well by the industry?
Absolutely. I have a fire truck right outside my window. Yes. So, sorry, say it one.
The noise and cleanliness issues with outdoor dining that you hear about from some of the residents, and also, being on your community board, I'm sure this comes up as well. And how has that been addressed by the industry?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry. The noise that the residents hear, like the noise that I hear from the fire truck out the window. No, certainly. I mean, one, I'd say let's put everything in perspective when it comes to outdoor dining, or really, in my opinion, anything else impacting the city. We are in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic. A lot of things and policies that have been enacted have been done so quickly because there wasn't time to waste. So one, I think if there's an issue with a specific restaurant and cleanliness, reach out to the restaurant. I think often people just, and I'm not suggesting this is what this person's doing or something, but some people just, see something and they file a complaint. So often business owners, have so much going on, they may not notice something. So, reach out, give people the benefit of the doubt and an opportunity to try and correct it. We had been working with the city for a long time, and they launched a program called MEND through the city's Office of Nightlife. And I should just say, I am the chair of the city's Office of Nightlife Advisory Board, just in transparency. But MEND basically is a contact you can call if there's noise issues, if there's garbage issues, or if there's other types of conflicts between eating and drinking establishments and residents. And they go in and they really try to mediate the situation to come to a more kind of effective issue, closure, or do something that works for all parties. So definitely it's MEND. I forget what the acronym exactly stands for, but that's something definitely to address. When it comes to just, cleanliness of the streets, I mean, part of it, yes, is the restaurants, but a lot of it is not. So I think when we talk about funding for essential services like sanitation, how often are the garbages being collected? and turnover is something really important, especially in areas where you may have more to-go food. So people are, just throwing the garbage in the garbage cans. They get, cleaned up, or, they get filled up quicker. So definitely reach out to the business. You can reach out, I'd say, to the MEN program, which is through the city's Office of Nightlife. Also trying to submit ideas. I mean, we're always open. If we're going to make outdoor dining a more permanent program, what could be some, best practices to help, address this.
So apparently the acronym is Mediating Establishment and Neighborhood Disputes.
There you go.
There's some more information in the Q&A about that if people are interested. I have two more quick questions. Well, one of them maybe isn't so quick, but maybe you could give us a quick answer. The mayoral race, as you know, is coming up in 2021, but really the primary is coming up soon, and that may decide our next mayor for 8 years. The next 6 months may decide the next 8 years, I like to say. What are some of the issues that you're raising to the candidates to make sure that, these issues of the hospitality industry, which is such an important industry to our city, that's on their radar and on their agenda?
Yeah, so, well, number one, whoever becomes our next mayor has a monumental, awesome task in front of them. And that is going to take listening to people, working with people, and not just talking about it, but actually being about it. And that's going to take actual policies and political will, which I keep going back to. So one, I think they need to understand the size, scope, and impact of this industry. I mentioned before, more than 25,000 eating and drinking establishments, more than 300,000 workers. The nightlife industry alone generates more than $30 billion of economic activity annually. So that doesn't even include, restaurants that offer breakfast and lunch. And people work in every, they work in the industry, or restaurants are in every industry. Bars are in, every neighborhood. Restaurants are in every neighborhood. The people that work in these establishments are in every neighborhood. So when they're thinking of public policy, they need to understand that this industry and the people that power it are really at its core. So understanding and appreciating what it means for the city, and really looking at policies to do with rent forgiveness, because we released a recent report, we've been doing it almost monthly, found that in the month of October, 88% of respondents were unable to pay full or any rent, and only 1 in 10 had renegotiated their leases. And this is on top of the same data, almost month after month after month, going back really to April, when they started being unable to pay their rent. And one of the reasons that this is so important is because if we don't deal with the rent issue, you could see a default or defaults throughout the system. And for landlords, if they're unable to collect rent, they may be unable to pay their mortgage obligations, meaning that there could be defaults throughout the system. And if all of these entities are unable to pay, they're unable to pay property taxes. And as people probably know, property taxes are responsible for funding so many of the city's essential services that we're going to need to, recover. So I think I would make the connection with data about how important it is to save this industry, to help save the city, and then really push them on policies. The last thing I'd say is a lot of what they need to do or not do is going to be contingent on what the federal government does or does not do when it comes to New York City's businesses, funding for transportation. So, I can talk about all things like allowing fines and cure periods. How are we going to roll out permanent outdoor dining? We need a permanent cap on third-party delivery fees that pre-pandemic we're charging, upwards of 30% of each order, which is more than the restaurants even took for themselves. Looking at ownership of customer data. A lot of these third-party apps where you place a delivery, you make a reservation, they own the customer data, which basically puts a wall between the restaurant and their customer. It also provides leverage for those companies over the restaurants because they know they can't leave that platform, because if they do, they're going to lose access to their customers. And then that third party could end up using that customer data to promote to one of their competitors. So there's a lot of kind of in the weeds, different types of policies, but I think the overarching theme is understanding the economic and social importance of the city's hospitality industry to the city as a whole, when it comes to bringing tourists back, when it comes to bringing office workers back who are going to want to have a place to go grab coffee in the morning, lunch in the afternoon, a nice bar to go have happy hour after work, and then hopefully a great restaurant to go have dinner at. So that recognition and a guarantee that they are going to fight for policies for this industry is going to be very important. And it's going to take more than just saying, I love small businesses, I love restaurants, we need to support them. It's going to actually take policies and political will, some of which I just spoke about, to actually help them.
So last question, what can we do other than, lobbying our elected officials? What can we do as patrons of New York City hospitality businesses? How can are there any helpful actions that we can take to support the industry during this time?
Yeah, well, first, this ABNY plan you talked about at the beginning, with the hashtags, that's important. I think seriously, like on social media, just the power of it, make sure that you are out and about documenting, showing that you're supporting these businesses. But there are things, if, restaurants offer, gift cards, buy them now to use them in the future, because these restaurants, they do need cash flow. If you are ordering a delivery, call the restaurant directly, go directly to its website, not through a third party. That way they have your data so they can better market to you and kind of customize your experience. And they don't pay these big fees. So go directly to the restaurant's website, call them directly, call their 212 number or their 718 number, not like an 866 number that's often set up by these third parties where they take a cut, and really just recognize that businesses are struggling. So go out safely, explore different neighborhoods, maybe go outside of like where you normally go and try out new places, tell people about it, because that's really what they need. They just need as many people out eating and drinking and supporting them as possible. If they sell merchandise on their website, get a cool shirt or a hat, whatever, lend support. And then of course, just the advocacy, just out there saying, we need to save our restaurants. And if you have relationships with government officials, reiterating it. And I'd finally say that's a little bit political is, we talk about the mayor, we talk about the president, the city council races. I mean, what is it, something like 35 seats are turning over? People on this call are politically active. You're speaking with different candidates. Demand they support policies and they promote policies and they come up with policies that support restaurants, that support nightlife, that support other small businesses. A lot of focus is on all different types of issues, but make sure that anyone you meet, see, speak with, who is running for office in the city council or any other level of government has a robust policy platform for restaurants and nightlife.
Great, thank you. Just wanted to remind everyone to take a selfie with your restaurant menu or takeout bag, post it on Twitter, Instagram, and tag ABNY, and it's the NYC Alliance is your handle, and hashtag NYC Dining December. That's through the month of December. And I think Sarah's going to come back on to say for some closing remarks.
Hi, everyone. I'd just like to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Laura, for being such an excellent moderator. And Andrew, we can't thank you enough. We know this is such a hard time for restaurants and you must be crazy busy. So thank you for taking the time this morning. And I hope you all support local restaurants. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.